Lucky to have him as a part of my professional world, and then also my personal world as well, to kind of help mentor and guide all kinds of children through the pathways of adolescence. So, without further ado, Carl Pickhardt.
Thank you. Well, it's good to be with you tonight. What I'm going to try to do with the time we have is to give you a sense about why an adolescent is not a child, what the difference is, what the changes are, and how the adolescent is not simply about a young person changing on the way from childhood to adulthood. Because as the child changes, the parent changes in response, and the relationship changes. So adolescence is a family change. And what happens is that it's not just that the young person has challenges associated with growing up. You and I as parents have challenges trying to figure out how to support our young person as they're going through these changes. I think probably the place to start is just to defuse something. There is a kind of a mythology of the terrible teen, and it's really, I think it's something people really can usefully dispel. There's a lot of negative stereotypes of what, this kind of some kind of monster that your kid turns into in adolescence. That is really, truly not so. Absolutely, there will be changes that you will see, and I'm going to talk about some of those changes tonight. But you are not destined to go through some kind of agony with your adolescent. Certainly, you are going to have to go through the dance of change with your adolescent. But that change, can be well within your tolerance limits. I mean, I think about a third of the kids tend to make the transformation of child to young adult really well within the tolerances of family, and there seems to be almost no noticeable abrasion, and these are the easy teenagers. And then you get another third who probably are what you would call the average teenagers who bump against the system a little bit, and finally you get a final third who sometimes when they bump they get stuck for a while, and those are the kind of situations that tend to come my way because people are trying to figure out how to get unstuck and move forward. That said, if you have one easy adolescent, you're probably not likely to have another one. So that, enjoy the one you have, but don't suppose that that's going to be the prototype that the one or more, who come after are going to follow. I guess the other thing is that I think adolescence is a really exciting time to parent a kid. Because what you are seeing is this incredible transformation from girl to young woman, from boy to young man. And to be part of that transformation, I think, is really exciting. So let me start by talking a little bit about the change that I think you're likely to see and some of the challenges that you're likely to face. Over the years, I've had parents make various kinds of statements about what it's like to have a child turn into an adolescent. My favorite one was a mom a number of years ago who made a statement that really characterized how jarring the change was for her. Her statement was, how would you like it if your attentive dog started acting like your disinterested cat? And I thought, wow, that's a pretty neat image. And I sort of hung with that for a while and thought about, the dog is friendly, the cat is more standoffish, the dog is affectionate, cat more irritable, dog is compliant, the cat is more willful, dog is grateful, the cat is entitled, the dog is communicative, the cat is kind of inscrutable, the dog is kind of constant in behavior, the cat is kind of changing a lot, the dog is kind of close, the cat is kind of remote. That the quality of change that she was describing was, how is she going to now parent somebody who is behaving significantly differently than when they were just parent and child in relationship. I've always loved that Nora Ephron had a wonderful line, as I've always loved. When your children are teenagers, it's important to have a dog so that someone in the house is happy to see you. I thought it was a grand statement. And then there's the bumper sticker I saw a while back, which captured part of it. Children have owners, adolescents have staff. And all of a sudden, what you see is there's this kind of reversal that happens in this process. Specifically, you do start seeing some changes. And again, in most cases, these changes are within your tolerance limits. So the parent who says, who stole my child? Or, gosh, the wheels have come off the truck. What are they talking about? Well, roughly speaking, the child was positive. The adolescent very often becomes more negative. The child was appreciative. The adolescent becomes more complaining. The child was confiding. Adolescent becomes more private. The child was much more admiring. Adolescent becomes more critical. The child is more compliant. The adolescent becomes more resistant. The child is more family-centered. The adolescent is more friend-centered. The child is agreeable. The adolescent becomes more argumentative. The child was more interested. The adolescent becomes more bored. The child was more focused. Now the adolescent is more distracted. The child was more orderly. The adolescent becomes more disorganized. The child was satisfied. The adolescent is more discontent. The child was more retentive. The adolescent is more forgetful. So, all of a sudden you're seeing these kinds of changes happen. And in fact, it really does seem like now you have, a different parenting task than you had before. Now you kind of have to refigure how you're going to do this dance, and it is a dance. Partly you're leading and partly you're following, and you're trying to figure out when to do which and how to do that. I think my job tonight is to help you maybe clarify your expectations about what kinds of changes are in the offing and what kinds of strategies can be helpful as you do this dance. Expectations are really important. Expectations are mental sets that have powerful emotional consequences when they are not met or when they are violated. So let's just take the child-adolescent shift here. And think about three kinds of expectations: predictions, ambitions, and conditions. And all of these have to do with anticipating what kind of change is in the offing. And it makes a difference whether these expectations are realistic or unrealistic. Because when they're unrealistic, all of a sudden you and I as parents can have emotional consequences that can get in the way of our parenting, I think. So for example, take a prediction. Based upon my experience with my child, my adolescent, will be affectionate and compliant. And now all of a sudden the kid comes, is not comfortable that much with physical affection and starts being more resistant. Well, you see, if I expected that might happen to some degree, that's one thing. But suppose I didn't expect that. Suppose I expected the adolescent essentially to behave the same way as the child. Well, now when my prediction is violated, what happens is I get anxious. I don't know what's going on, and I don't know what will happen. Or take an ambition. My child always wanted to do their academic best and really put a primary emphasis and enjoyment on company with me. And now all of a sudden they become more adolescent, and now they're more concerned with somehow just getting by is doing good enough. and they're more concerned with time with friends. And now what happens is, because my ambition has been violated, now I'm feeling disappointed, maybe even hurt. Or finally, take another one, take the condition. You know, my child should keep me adequately and accurately informed. Now what happens is the child, who now realizes as the prime informant about their lives that I rely on, they are in a position to manipulate that information for their own best interest. And now sometimes I don't get accurate information and I don't get adequate information. And now what happens is, with that expectation has been violated, that condition, I can end up angry. I raise these kinds of issues because what happens is, if we cannot change our expectations to approximate the changing reality of the child, what's going to happen is we're going to start thinking emotionally. And now what will happen is that disappointment and anxiety and anger can rule our decision making, and we'll end up kind of pouring gasoline on the fire, when in fact what we need to do is, we need to make reasonable judgments about how to behave in this situation. So I raise all that only to say that what I'm going to try to do tonight is to give you a sense of what are kind of normal changes to expect. Now, expect does not mean accept. For example, if your adolescent starts lying to you more, selectively informing you when they could not give you the full story, that doesn't mean that you say, oh, well, I expected that to happen and that's okay. No, lying is not okay. Matter of fact, it's very serious. You have to take it seriously. There is no such thing as a small lie, and if a kid gets into a habit of lying with you, then all of a sudden they start corrupting the relationship in ways that make it very hard to trust. But if you expected that might happen, at least you're not thrown by it. At least you say, well, I knew this might happen some, and now I can deal directly with it. So what we're dealing with then is understanding that the expectations that fit the reality of the child in some ways don't fit the reality of the adolescent. So now we've got parents who are not only adjusting their expectations, but making certain other kinds of attitude adjustments as well. Let me just suggest 5 of them for you, or 4 of them for you. Number one, it's important to remember that your adolescent, no matter how irritating or offending or upsetting, is not out to get you. The kid is not acting this way in order to get you upset. And if you think about it, you can kind of understand why, because adolescence is a very self-centering process. And in that process, what happens is the kid is just managing themselves, and they're not thinking enough about anybody else to think about getting them. They're just thinking about themselves, and so, calculated, they probably are not. Inconsiderate, yes, but calculated, probably not. Don't treat adolescence as some kind of punishable offense. You need to separate the process from the choices. What happens is that you want to be able to say, for example, you've got a kid who is now feeling more negatively about how their life is going. And that's part of the discontent that starts early adolescence. So now the kid comes home and they've had a bad day at school with friends and they're kind of feeling down and they're in a bad mood and they decide to take care of their bad feelings by treating a younger sibling badly. Well, you can say, well, there's process going on and there's also choice. So, your statement to the young person is, it is okay for you to come home and have had a bad day, but it is not okay for you to take that badness out on a younger sibling as a whipping post. So what that means is that I am here to hear about, whatever hardship you had, but I can't stand by and have you take that out on somebody else. So you accept the process, but you monitor the choice. It's important to understand that adolescence wears the magic out of parenting. You may have been enchanted with the 4-year-old, but you put 10 years on that kid. And you're probably not as enchanted as you used to be, and they're probably not as enchanted with you. And what's important to remember about that is that adolescence is partly an abrasive process. It wears down the dependency between parent and adolescent until at the end, they are sufficiently disenchanted with each other, they are willing to let each other go. I mean, if you ended up, with a kid who was as enamored of you at age 3 as they are, hitting their, early 20s, nobody would let anybody go. Doesn't mean that an abrasive process does not mean that there's any loss of love. It just means that the dance, when to lead, when to follow, how to do what, has become more complicated. And finally, it's important to accept that teenagers are just naturally offensive. And that's not an insult. That's not a criticism. That is basically to say, look, a healthy adolescent is supposed to push for all the freedom they can get as soon as they can get it. Healthy parents restrain that push within the interest of safety and responsibility. And that conflict of interest unfolds over the course of adolescence. What that means is that one of the central skills that you really have to have is when you're working with your adolescents through some of these periods where there is more disagreement than you had before, is you've got to have conflict management skills so that you can constructively deal with these differences and disagreements, partly to work your way through them, but also partly by example and instruction to have the kid understand how to do that. Because, the management of constructive conflict is absolutely essential. If for some reason you have to take a look at your training model. You may have grown up in a family, for example, where differences and disagreements arose. They were confronted, they were safely discussed, they were resolved, and people went forward accordingly with the difference resolved. However, suppose you came up in a family where that was not how conflict was conducted. Suppose conflict was not allowed. Or suppose conflict was connected with people getting hurt. You see, if you have those kinds of background variables, how comfortable you are in the dance of conflict with your adolescents will make a difference. So if for any reason you came up with a model for interpersonal conflict in your family that you do not want to repeat with your adolescent, then just think about how would I like to conduct conflict differently. I can certainly, from personal experience, I came up where they're in a family where a lot of times for my folks, there really were not any kind of small issues, because small things had big explosions. And so what happened was that it was easy to pop off in conflict. And I had to decide, did I want to repeat that dance with kids of my own, or did I want to try to do it differently? And my desire was to do it differently, you can, if you change things on your side of the relationship, all of a sudden you model a different kind of behavior for your adolescent to learn on their side. So, The use of conflict to deal with increasing disagreements and differences. Very, very important to this process. And if you're uncomfortable with it, then talk about it with yourself. How can I change my behavior in conflict to model the kind of communication I would like to have with my kid and the kind of communication I'd like them to learn? Now, if you think about the process of adolescence, let me give you just one way to think about the process and what it's directed towards. I think there are basically two main goals for adolescence. So that when your kid ends up this 10 to 12 year period of transformation, two things are achieved. One is that there is a functional independence, and the other one is that there is a fitting identity. And the process of adolescence is how that process, how those goals are met. And the easiest way to think about it is to go back when they were little children and think about what you wanted to do with a child. How did you want to secure that child? Well, one is you wanted to have, some kind of attachment parenting, where what you did was you wanted to create a basic trust and dependency, because reliance for security on the parents was absolutely critical. You wanted that basic trust there. So with tending and touching and talking and caretaking, you built that attachment, and that needs to be there, that fundamental dependence and reliance. The other thing you wanted to have not just attachment parenting, but you wanted similarity parenting. And that had to do with this child experiencing basic commonalities with the parents. And that has to do with being like parents, imitating parents, to create this sense of belonging. The child wanting to be like parents, and that's why they do so much copying and following and sharing. So you want those two kinds of bonds in place, the bond of attachment and the bond of similarity. Well, those are absolutely critical in childhood, but they've got to change once you start moving into adolescence. And what happens is that at that point, the relationship is strained on both sides. So think about what happens on the attachment parenting side. Well, what happens is somewhere around 9 to 13, early adolescence starts setting in. And at that point, what you have is the kid starts detaching from childhood. And they do that to get more freedom of action. And at that point, parents feel a loss of traditional control. And what happens is the kid has this powerful recognition. They realize that when they were a child, they had this illusion that parents could make them and stop them. But that was the age of command. When they hit adolescence, that takes them out of the age of command and into the age of consent, where they know that my parents cannot make me or stop me without my cooperation, and I am in control of that choice. Very, very liberating. And now what happens is, what happens is the kid is now starting to make more independent choices. Sometimes within the agenda of parents, sometimes not. And when they go outside of that, all of a sudden, you and I as parents are faced with a corrective choice. We don't want this kid to keep this behavior going. So how do we deal with correction? Well, I would suggest that what you try to do is you try to deal with correction non-evaluatively. And at this point forward, you are not in the business of criticizing the character of your child based upon the choices that they make. Particularly the choices that they make that you wish they had not made. Because what happens at that point is they're too vulnerable, and you start making critical statements about, boy, that was a crazy thing to do, that was a stupid thing to do, how could you have done that? And And all of a sudden now, what happens is the relationship starts getting more frayed, because now the kid sees this parent not as working with them as they grow, but all of a sudden working against them with this power of disapproval and criticism. So what you want to do is, when adolescence starts, you want to be able to take issues with choices only. And the mantra is, the non-evaluative correction mantra is, I disagree with the choice you have made. This is why, and this is what I need to have you do differently, and this is what I hope you have learned as a function of this. Always taking issue with choices, staying away from criticism. Because if you can work with the kid on choices and they can feel that they are not under threat of disapproval or criticism, they are more likely to work with you around the issue of correction. If you take the other side, the similarity parenting side, what you've got is that now the child starts differentiating from the child they were and from how you and I are as parents. And what this means is that the kid basically says, in words or action, I'm different from you. I'm going to be I'm different from the way I was as a child, and I'm going to be different from the way you want me to be. And all that has to do with trying out, experimenting with different kinds of differences. And some of these differences, remember, this kid is growing up in a different generation from you and I. I mean, there's been a whole cultural shift. So they're going to be interested in stuff you and I were never interested in. So what are we going to do with those differences? Are we going to say, well, I am not interested in that difference, and we dismiss it? Or maybe we say, well, I don't understand. I don't think that's not a good way for you to spend your time. And we can discount it. But what's happening is the kid is searching for more self-expression, experimentally trying on and off a whole series of images, interests, relationships, in this process of trying to come up and end up with a fitting identity. So what do we do with some of these foreign differences that arise? Well, the first thing is, it really is helpful to understand that most of these differences are trial differences. They are not terminal differences. So that, the kid who at the age of 13 says, on no uncertain terms, that they want to dye their hair blue does not mean at the age of 20 that they're going to go around with blue hair. I don't know why they want blue hair. But if it's within your tolerance limits, and it seems to be something that they can, try and get through and go forward, that might be something, that you can, try to understand what's going on. And what you're trying to do is, you're trying not to just criticize differences, but you want to bridge differences with interest. For example, suppose video games, computer games are not your thing. Matter of fact, you cannot understand why anybody would want to waste their time playing computer games. And you let the kid know that. And now what happens is this difference, instead of becoming a bridge to understanding, becomes a barrier. And the difference now gets in the way of the relationship. But if you bridge that difference with interest, it becomes very different. And you do that by saying, that interest is something I know nothing about. Could you tell me what you like about it? Could you show me how to do it? Could you help me appreciate it? And at that point, what happens is you create a very, very powerful dynamic. And it's an esteem-filling dynamic for the kid. Because now what happens is that all of a sudden, you've got a power reversal. You are now the student. Your adolescent is now the teacher, and they know more about this thing than you do. And as they take you through that, they gather instructional power. So on both sides of these two paths of growth, towards independence, towards identity, What you're trying to do is you're trying to stay connected as adolescence grows you apart, as it is meant to do. And staying connected, I think, has a lot to do with being non-evaluative in your correction and bridging unfamiliar differences with interest. Now again, part of the issue that happens here is that it's more easy to get into argument with your child about, on either side, with either on the independent side of what the kid wants to do or with a difference they're interested in. Sometimes parents say, what I can't stand is the way this kid always argues with me. And I just want to stop the argument. I'm sick of it. Just, shut it down. And my response is, why would you possibly want to do that? Your kid in adolescence is the primary informant about their world, what matters to them, what means something to them. I mean, if you get an argument, what's happening is this kid is letting you know what's important to them. I mean, it seems to me if your kid wants to argue with you, you want to say, can you help me better understand? Can you tell me more? Because they are informing you and you need that information. Remember, this kid, not only does this kid have power of consent now, but they have power over how much information they're going to share with you about to what degree they're willing to be known. And when they argue with you, they are communicating with you and they are allowing themselves to be known. Now certainly, the language that is used, you may want to take issue with that. But if they are in fact declaring something about who they are, what they want, what they believe, that information is golden. And if you think an argumentative child is a problem, let me tell you what's a worse problem. A worse problem is a mystery child. And a mystery child is a child that tells you nothing. A no-data child. And that is no fun. On balance, if you take parents and say, which would you rather have? An argumentative child or a no-data child? Most parents would say, I like the argumentative child. Because otherwise you are left at the mercy of your own ignorance. So what are some of the adjustments then? Well, again, what we're trying to do is, and the best image that I know for this is a dance. You're trying to dance with your adolescents around as they do more detachment for independence, more differentiation for identity. You're trying to keep dancing with that so that you can stay connected as you grow apart. For parents, what this means is that there are some adjustments you're simply going to have to make. The parent's going to be less fully informed than they were before. I have to get by on less information than I would ideally like to know. The parent's going to find the relationship less compatible. We don't share as much in common as we once did. The parent will be left more alone. I am no longer my child's favorite company. The parent will be less in charge. I have less influence to get my way, and the parents will encounter more opposition. We have more frequent disagreements than we had before. When we are talking about managing our adolescent is a secondary concern. First concern is managing ourselves. We've got to manage our side of the dance in such a way, that we can keep our emotional sobriety and we can stay connected as these changes unfold. So what kinds of changes? I mean, we're talking about early adolescence, 9 to 13. I mean, what do you look for when these kid starts entering the chute? Well, I think the first thing you look for is more personal disorganization. The self-management system that was adequate for the child is no longer adequate in the larger world of adolescence. The world has opened up. School gets more complicated. All of a sudden, they're looking beyond the family circle now. Friends are operating in more worldly ways. So now what happens is they have a lot more to manage than they ever did before. So that, remember, adolescence begins with loss. The loss that the parents feel is that they will never have their adoring and adorable little child again. That is over. For the child, an adolescent, what it means is that they can never go home again. They can't go back home to that simpler, sheltered, more secure world of childhood again. They can only grow forward. So adolescence begins with loss. But again, the other side of loss is freedom. Freedom from old restraints and freedom for new opportunities, and that's growth. And that's what pulls the kid forward. And you and I, what we're trying to do is we're trying to do the dance to stay connected, to help follow the kid and lead the kid as they grow towards independence and identity. So when they start, they're more disorganized, and you get more distractibility and impulsivity and forgetting and losing track of things and messiness. All these signs of personal disarray. So if your kid becomes more disorganized and they can't keep track of things, that is not something to get impatient about. It's not something to criticize the kid about. It's something to coach the kid about. They need help developing a new self-management system to cope with increasing complexity in their life. So you and I are trying to give them coaching assistance to get that to happen. Then you get a more negative attitude. Well, the reason I think you get the more negative attitude is that now what happens is this child in words and action is essentially saying, I am no longer content to be defined and treated as a child anymore. I don't know what I do want at this early stage, but I do know what I don't want. And that's where a lot of the negativity comes out. And sometimes it's like the kid now gets more of a sense of grievance. It's not fair and it's not right. Who are you to tell me what I can or cannot do? You're not the boss of the world. But you see, we are the boss of their world. And so now all of a sudden, sometimes, that creates more tension in the relationship. And then what happens is you start getting more active in passive resistance. And you start getting more active resistance because you get, for example, more arguing, like we talked about. But that's not the one that gets parents. The one that gets them very often is the passive resistance. You ask them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times to get something done, and it's not done, and you say, I want it done now. And the kid looks at you and says, you don't think I'm so upset about it. And what's happening? Well, what's happening is the kid is using delay to see if, in fact, how much room they can get, and maybe if they can get enough room, you'll give up, and they'll let you alone about it, or they'll even do it themselves. Both mistakes, don't make those mistakes. As this kid is changing, that's one of the besetting sins, I think, of most of us as parents is that we're not consistent enough. So we say we want this, but we don't follow through on this. And ideally, you don't make any request of the kid without committing to follow through and get it to happen. Because if the kid believes that sometimes you want it and sometimes you'll let it go, they will vote for let it go. But you see, it's not just, again, it's not just the kid who's disorganized. You and I are disorganized. We're wondering, what are we dealing with now? And we've got so much on our plate. Yes, we asked about this, but all of a sudden, subsequent to that, these things were going on, and we never got back to this. So you've got to decide, when you really want something, that you're willing to put in the supervisory pursuit to get it to happen. And then you get early experimentation. And that's testing various kinds of social rules and limits. more outlaw kinds of activities in the extreme. This is where very often you get more shoplifting and vandalizing and prank calls. So, one of the things that happened, for example, is, let's say your kid had a couple of friends over for the night, and one of them got this really great idea. You know the old guy down at the end of the block? At 1 a.m. in the morning, they called him and made this threatening phone call, and he got really upset, and it was really funny, except he had caller ID. So he calls back, and now your parents are woken up, and what do? What they do is they say, we are going to go down, and you're going to confront this person, and you're going to, number one, hear what it was like to be on the receiving end of this kind of treatment, and then we're going to figure out some kind of amends for you to make for what you did. And what parents are doing is that they're closing the loop of responsibility. And, sometimes parents will say, well, these are just small things, let them go. If you let the small stuff go, the small experimentation go, you will get bigger experimentation later on. So if your kid knows, that, you take this seriously, you want to be able to stick to that. So as adolescence is unfolding then, what's driving this growth? Well, I think there are 3 engines, and each of these engines creates its own kind of avenue of conflict. One engine is separation, and that's to create more distance and room for growth. And there you get the desire for more privacy and time with friends. And now you can get conflict between time with, family time and time with friends. And some of those conflicts can happen at that point. Then you get experimentation, trying out different kinds of differences in images for identity, and seeking alternative definitions to see what individuality fits. And so all of a sudden your kid comes down there, ready for school, and you say, you cannot wear that to school. The kid says, what's the matter with it? Well, in my judgment, that really does not fit, how I would like you to present yourself to school, and you can have a discussion about that. Because you see what happens is now the kid is differentiating and experimenting, and you're trying to set ground rules on, to what degree and in one fashion this experimentation can take place. And then of course you get opposition, where the kid asserts more resistance and persistence, and what they want to do is they want to operate more on their own terms. And that leads to the issue, that the kid, it's a very dear issue, the adolescent. It has to do with basically, how do I get freedom to grow? With my parents, with you, how am I going to get the freedom I want? And you've got to have a response to that. I think you have to have a freedom contract. You have to literally let the kid know on what basis of their behavior you were really willing to put them at risk of more freedom. And just consider, what might be some elements of this contract. One is believability. This kid is giving you adequate and accurate information. So when they come to the table to negotiate getting more freedom, they can say, I've been giving you good information. The kid is giving you predictability. They're keeping promises and agreements. They're exercising responsibility. They're taking care of business at home, at school, and out in the world. Mutuality. They are living on two-way terms with you. It's not you just doing for them. They are also doing for you. There is availability. They are willing to discuss your concerns whenever they arise, and they will do so with civility. They will communicate with courtesy and respect. So if your kid comes to you, and they want some kind of freedom, and you kind of check that contract off and say, well, based upon that, I might be willing, under these circumstances, to allow you more freedom. But, for example, in terms of believability, if the kid is lying to you, if they're not keeping their promises in terms of predictability, if they're not taking care of business in terms of responsibility, they just want to live on one-way terms, they refuse to talk to you when you want to talk to them, and when they do so, they do so in uncivil ways, you say, hey, you and I are both on the same side. We want you to have freedom to grow. But there are conditions. And, these are some of the things I need from you to be able to consider freedom, and you need to bring this kind of record to the table. Years ago, this is an odd thing to share with you, but what I was curious about was, why is it that some kids seem to be really anchored into family much more than other kids? And at least as I was trying to sort it out, it seemed to me that there were 8 kinds of anchors that parents had in place for this kid who was growing up, both in terms of independence and identity, but doing so while they were still firmly connected to family. Let me just suggest what these might be. Each of these has its specific behaviors have symbolic value. They don't just stand alone. Just like, for example, different one, listening is not just a specific behavior. It represents somebody willing to say that they believe that what you have to say is worth attending to. So it's an act of affirmation. Well, in terms of these anchors, one of them would be completing homework. Well, that has academic importance, but it also has importance way beyond that. As work ethic training. You and I take it for granted. We do stuff every day that we don't particularly want to do. But that's part of life. You have to learn how to do that. It's part of the self-discipline of living, and it's part of the self-discipline we want the kid to learn. So that, homework is something that most kids do not bring home with delight, and want to do that when they've already had a full day of school. So that the kid being willing to work on their homework, all of a sudden, that's part of the work ethic that's taught in family. Cleaning up their room. The issue there is living on parental terms. That's the message. Why do I have to clean up my room? Because although it's your room, it's our home. And how you keep your room has to be in some degree consistent with how we want the home to be kept. See, are we up at time?
Just about out.
Okay, let me. The other ones have to do with household chores, membership contributions, certainly valued attendance at family gatherings, volunteer service, extremely powerful because it gets the kid out of their own sphere. They realize somebody else has needs and they have something important to offer. Saving money, not just spending money, but delaying gratification, very important. Developing self-interest in terms of pillars of self-esteem. And also, very important, when your kid enters adolescence, you want to increase the number of salient adults that are in that kid's life. They can be friends of the family, parents of friends, extended family, but what you're trying to do is you're trying to get adults who come in and value this kid in mature ways that peers do not. You want to balance that out. So all of this is to say there is a dance going on here, and it's a complicated dance for the kid, and it's complicated for us, but it is a dance, it's worth doing, and we're trying both by leading and following to help the kid reach those two goals at the end of things, where they have a functional independence and a fitting identity. It's good being with you tonight. You gather off to the classroom now. Good being with you. Enjoyed it.